Hello again, everybody. Laurie White with the Greater Providence Chamber of Commerce. How are you doing today? Episode number 166 of Chamber TV. And we're continuing our discussion with the candidates seeking public office in Rhode Island in 2022. And today we're talking to Gonzalo Cuervo, who is seeking to become the next mayor of the city of Providence. Great to see you again, Gonzalo. Thanks for being with us.
Hi, Laurie. Thanks for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks again for coming to our Government Affairs Committee meeting the other day and talking a little bit about some of the priorities that you see in your wider campaign. And today we're going to be talking to a larger audience, an audience of business leaders, chamber leaders who are very interested in what's going to happen next in the city and the fortunes of our capital city and a lot of the issues that are facing downtown businesses. So with that said, let me officially introduce you and ask you to give us your backstory.
Well, thank you, Laurie. My name is Gonzalo Cuervo. I'm 48 years old. I was born in Providence and I've lived there most of my life. And I've actually spent most of my life advocating for the people of Providence in very different capacities. When I was still a teenager, I got involved in a lot of community organizing and activism on the south side of Providence around issues such as housing, education, police community relations. I later had the opportunity to own and operate a small business on the south side, which was a graphics and printing business that really was, most of my clients were businesses. So it really gave me an opportunity to understand the realities and challenges of being a small business person in the city at that time. Then I went on to work in the private sector and I ended up becoming the communications director for the incoming Cicilline Mayoral administration almost two decades ago. And I spent 8 years working in the Cicilline administration, in that type of position. Then I had the opportunity to work in the Tavares administration, initially as deputy chief of staff, then promoted to chief of staff. And after that, I had the opportunity to go work at the State House with current Secretary of State Nellie Gorbea as her chief of staff and deputy secretary of state, and really play a critical role in helping her pass her legislative agenda and really managing those relationships and learning how that legislative process works and how to affect change in that challenging environment. And now, for the past year or so, I've been focused on running for office. And I've been meeting with folks and talking with people, business owners, residents, neighborhood groups, community leaders on the challenges and the opportunities that our cities face. And that's really why I'm running, because I see the great opportunities that we have here in Providence. I see the human talent. I see the institutional resources that we have here and all the great things that make this such a fascinating place. But it's also creating challenges for many of our residents and many of our small businesses who seem to be getting pushed out. They're getting priced out of our city. And we need to make sure that we're creating a future for this city that is vibrant, diverse, and dynamic, and that strengthens our middle class. So we have a workforce. So we have a vibrant economic sector. We have economic development. We have safety, security, clean streets, and everything that we want to see in a city, and not going down a path where we end up just kind of becoming a bedroom community for folks who come here from Boston and other parts seeking more affordable housing.
Thank you for sharing your background. And you and I go back many years, and I certainly recall all those visits that we had with you in the Cicilline administration, the Tavares administration, and also working with Secretary Nellie Gorbea. So you have a great deal of public service exposure, experience, insights to how the government and political process works. How would you describe the city that you are seeking to inherit in 2022 as mayor from the city that perhaps you saw with Mayor Cicilline?
Well, I think, over the last 20 years, the city has made a lot of progress in many areas, particularly in terms of fiscal stability. The city has had fairly stable finances. Particularly in recent years, we've seen this current administration has been a good, competent caretaker of the city's finances. And we've seen growth in the city. We've seen a lot of growth in the city. But I think there are also a lot of opportunities for improvement. I think the city in recent years has not done a good job of managing relationships at the State House, or even managing relationships within the city council and within the city administrative structure, to have a vision, to move the city forward, to create long-term sustainable programs for economic development, for community development, or even for youth development in areas as critical as public education, public safety, and just the delivery of city services. So I think, we've certainly advanced and we've made significant strides forward, but there are always challenges that we must address, and there are long-standing kind of systemic underlying issues that we tend to put band-aids on and hope that they will be fixed in the future, and they need to be addressed.
You mentioned relationships with the city council, also with the state house, and your ability to cross over party lines and to understand how the buildings operate. Can you give us some examples of what your style might be when we're speaking about developing relationships, again, on behalf of the city, on behalf of the capital city, and helping to position among the views of all Rhode Islanders that so goes the capital city, so goes Rhode Island. And a lot of times, I've witnessed it. People, are not really up to speed in what's happening in the city, in the capital city, in the financial district, in the jewelry district, in the neighborhoods. And, people can become insular in their own geography, if you will. So how would you go about, Gonzalo, positioning the city to all Rhode Islanders as a place that needs to be supported by all of us?
Well, that's great, Laurie. If you think about it, we're talking about human relationships. And whether we're talking about marriage, friendship, business relationships, or intergovernmental relationships, relationships are based primarily on two things: communications and trust. If we're communicating properly to other folks and we're letting them know where we are, where we want to go, where we've been, what we want to do, and we are building trust with those individuals, that's how relationships flourish. If we're not good at communicating and we're not building trust with these individuals, we're not going to build relationships. So one of the things that we see is we see folks primarily in the legislature. A lot of our suburban legislators are very wary of the city of Providence for a number of reasons. Some are reasonable, some are justifiable to a degree, and others are just preconceived notions of people who may have escaped their own reality a generation or two ago from the city, and they just think that the city is a basket case, which is very erroneous. So I think there's an opportunity for us to build those relationships based on trust and based on communications. And I would argue that my skills, particularly during the time that I was in the Secretary of State's office, where I helped Secretary of State Corbea, move some critical pieces of legislation on voting access, on getting funding for new voting equipment, on lobby reform, on making government more transparent. These were issues that were not initially popular in the General Assembly. As a matter of fact, they were scoffed at many times because, particularly in the voting access realm, we were proposing changes that were going to impact some of the legislators' win formula. Like, they've been winning the same way for multiple cycles, and here we were proposing modernizations of systems that would cause them to have to reevaluate how they approach an election. Now, we communicated openly. We organized communities all over the state to testify and to come out and support. And we were transparent. We built trust with the legislators, and that's how we were able to accomplish this. And that's one thing that we can do at any level. That's applicable at any level of relationship building. And I think that, to a certain degree, has been missing in the way the city approaches the legislature in trying to get its legislative priorities lined up and passed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, an interesting perspective, and one that we are currently working on. As you well know, the Chamber, RIPEC, and the Providence Foundation are working on the proposed pension obligation bond with the leadership of the General Assembly. And it does have to be passed by the Assembly leaders in order to go forward, and also by the citizens of the city of Providence to refinance, if you will, pension obligation bonds. So what are your thoughts on winning messages? I know during our government affairs meeting, you indicated that you were going to be voting in support in June for this particular initiative. So what do you think the overarching issues are, and how would you sell it to a statewide audience?
Well, Laurie, I am supportive of it with the current safeguards. I recognize, as many of your members recognize, that pension obligation bonds have inherent risk, right? And so how do we minimize that risk? How do we minimize the exposure to taxpayers? And one of the challenges that we've seen with the city, I was at a community meeting last night in the Reservoir Triangle, and there were some very thoughtful, very intelligent people trying to explain the reasoning behind the pension obligation bond. And they were tying themselves into knots. One of them, an elected official, actually described what the conversation was as gobbledygook. Like that, literally used that word, which is remarkable to me. But ultimately, pension obligation bond, what we're doing is we're trying to borrow $500 million to make up for the fact that we have historically, for a generation, the city of Providence underfunded the pension system. And so now we're trying to play catch up. And that's essentially what this money is trying to do. We're trying to play catch up so that we can bring the pension fund to a funding level in around 60% that makes it sustainable long term without taking an ever increasing chunk out of our operating budget, which is what we're seeing now. And that we need to explain that to people in a way that they understand. You know, every year in the 80s and the 90s, that city administrations shorted the pension payment in order to balance the budget artificially. It's very simple for people to understand. You know, $2 million that we took away from investing in the stock market in 1991. If you had invested those $2 million in 1991 in the S&P 500 index or similar setup, they would have multiplied exponentially. And we lost that opportunity. We lost that opportunity for growing that money that should have been invested 20 years ago, 25 years ago, 30 years ago. And now we have to play catch up. And unfortunately, you know, the pension obligation bond is not an ideal scenario. It's not pension reform, but it's basically a stopgap measure so that we can get our pension plan to a funding level that is safe.
Yeah, all of these, all of these instruments, if you will, possess a certain degree of risk. But I think what is motivating us to look favorably towards the proposal is that, as you pointed out, in the 70s, 80s, previous administrations not making the annual retired contribution into the fund, and those gains were lost, those potential gains in the stock market, as you just recounted. But in recent years, mayors have done that. They have been responsible. They are trying to play catch up, but unfortunately, the way the dynamics work and the actuarial calculations, what we're seeing now is a crowding out of the ability to devote new city resources to other important initiatives, like sidewalks at schools and economic development and the like. So, it's one of those things where, you have to really, we've been trying to solve it for a very long time, and the solution has eluded us. And with market conditions being somewhat favorable now and lower interest rates, although we are heading in a different direction, the environment for such an instrument appears to be, more favorable than it previous was. But everything has a certain element of risk to it.
And I think there's something that gives me a lot of promise for the future. Is number one, we have continued to grow the city's tax base, right? And number two, if you look at the labor contracts that have been negotiated from the mid 2000s, let's say in the last three administrations, from the mid 2000s to the present, there has been a recognition that we had to curtail some of these unsustainable benefits that were given out in the past. And so what happens as city employees that are in those that are applicable to those negotiations and those contracts that were negotiated from, let's say, 2003 to the present, as they begin to age out of the workforce and enter into the pension system, the pension costs will not escalate into the future to the same level that they've escalated now, because the benefits are more affordable on one end, and on the other end, the city has made at or near 100% of the annual required contribution for almost the last 2 decades. So the future is much more promising. The problem is that we have to deal with the aftermath of decisions that were made a generation ago. And that's what I believe the pension obligation bond tries to accomplish with safeguards that have been put in place that weren't in place with the original proposal.
What do you think is a good message to rally all Rhode Islanders, not just about this particular matter, but really investing in the capital city and making sure that our businesses have a competitive tax base, that we have schools that work, that we have jobs that are being created. If you will, think about how to describe the fortunes of the capital city as an indicator, if you will, of the fortunes of the state in a larger basis.
Look, I believe Providence is the heart of Rhode Island, and there's no doubt that Providence is the economic center, the financial center, and the government center, the educational center, the healthcare center of our entire state. And no community will do well if Providence fails at any level, whether you want to look at it from a purely financial rating point, or if you want to look at it from a socioeconomic point of view. We need to ensure that Providence succeeds for everybody's benefit across the state of Rhode Island. And that's what I plan on doing as mayor. I want to make sure that we're growing our economy, that we're building a middle class from within, and that we're expanding the city's tax base to ensure a sustainable, flourishing future for our capital city and by extension for the state.
I love that. I think you articulated that extremely well, and it's very convincing. And together we need to continue to put those messages forward because it is really important, as you point out, the city of the center of government. So let me just build on the growing the tax base, ensuring that we are growing the middle class. Let's talk about how you might approach economic development in the city, and how would you go about recruiting a leader of the city's economic development department, and what would be an example of one or two things that you'd like to see accomplished?
Well, I think there's an opportunity for us to continue to focus our energy in making sure that downtown is successful. And I think it's fascinating to watch this evolution of urban centers from purely commercial and financial utilization of properties to a mixed use of commercial, financial, and residential. I think there's a brilliant future for Providence in that regard. But I also think we need to focus on economic development that looks beyond the downtown, that looks into neighborhood commercial districts, that looks into the port, that looks into underutilized land that we can develop. And I think it would be important to have an economic development department that can share that vision, that can be agile and can understand those different realities and can work closely with the state. Because what I think we have found is the city of Providence has usually either tried to do its own thing independent of the state and ended up in an almost adversarial position, or we have surrendered altogether and just let commerce and the state take the lead on economic development in our city. And I think there's a third path where we can work collaboratively and understanding that economic development isn't just attracting large investments and large employers, but it's also ensuring that our small commercial districts are successful, that as economies change with the way people consume, with the way people buy, with the way people spend their money, that we can adapt to those changes and be successful going into the future to grow our tax base and to create jobs for our workforce.
What are your thoughts on the Industrial Trust Tower and proposal on the table now to redevelop it to housing residential units with a certain component of affordable housing units, as opposed to a large commercial user like what was proposed, a few years ago? Over the course of the last decade, there have been a lot of proposals, a lot of suggestions, a lot of thoughts and ideas on what to do with that grand building. Wondering what you think about the proposal that was unveiled a couple of weeks ago at the State House.
Well, I think I'm excited that there's serious consideration of a plan to redevelop the building. When I worked for the city, I had the opportunity to walk through that building, walk, through not only the several of the floors in the lobby, but also into some of the kind of behind the scenes spaces where they have a lot of the mechanicals. And it's a beautiful, obsolete building, which really limits its viability on a number of different fronts. I think developing it into apartments is great. The concern that I have expressed and that I will continue to express is the city's exposure on its investment in the process. There were news reports during the commerce vote last week to approve initial funding for this project that made it clear that the state of Rhode Island has safeguards in place. They have safeguards in place for the money they're putting up, and they also have a role to play if down the line the developer decides to flip the building. The state can see some revenue, they can see some benefit from this eventual sale of the building. Whereas the city is being asked to put up $10 million from an affordable housing trust that was created specifically to develop affordable housing throughout the city, right? We borrowed $24 million at market rates, and we're loaning 10 of those $24 million at 1% to one developer. So not only are we losing the opportunity cost of developing affordable housing with $10 million, there's a tangible cost to the interest rate between the market rate that we borrowed at and the 1% that we're loaning the money forward to. That's several $100,000 a year that taxpayers are picking up. And in addition to that, we're being asked to write a check for $5 million at the end of the process as a payment to the developer. What do we get in exchange for that? I think it's fantastic that we're going to have 300 or 400 people living in that building and, contributing to our economy. But I think we should have safeguards in place that are similar, at least, to what Commerce has for the state funding.
Have you had an opportunity to chat with Secretary Pryor at Commerce about some of your ideas and how you believe the deal could be improved?
Well, I haven't had an opportunity to speak with Secretary Pryor, but I have had the opportunity to speak with Mayor Lorza and some of the council people. And I know that they're going to have the opportunity to vet this in a public process. And look, I'm not against the proposal. I realize that an iconic, unique building of this nature and of this scale requires public-private partnerships. And that's great. That's understandable. I absolutely think it's a great idea to redevelop the Superman building. But we're talking about taxpayer dollars at a time when Providence taxpayers, both families and small business owners, are being pushed to the limit. We're going through a reval now where a lot of commercial and homeowners are going to see their effective tax rate increase, their tax payment increase, when we're just getting out of a pandemic that has decimated our local economy. It's hard to have that conversation about giving money away without safeguards when we're also asking our taxpayers to pony up more cash out of pocket.
What are your thoughts about the tax rates in Providence, the commercial rate, the tangible rate, and other real estate valuations? What is your plan for thinking through how to correctly and appropriately balance all of those sources of revenue and at the same time create predictability for taxpayers and investors that are looking to make a long-term investment in the city and create jobs over a long trajectory?
Well, it's clear that our commercial tax rate is very high. And unfortunately, this is a function of being a post-industrial city that carries a lot of costs, legacy costs, as we see with the pension, as we see with infrastructure situations. So the challenge is, how do we keep those rates from growing and, if possible, lower those rates without impacting the fact that we need to keep government going? That's always a challenge. And the only true way to accomplish this in a sustainable way is by continuing to grow our tax base and ensuring that our tax base is growing at a quicker rate than the city budget is growing. This is possible. This is possible through strategic investment and through having an economic development vision that is broader than what we've seen in the past. The other thing is the tangible tax. I believe that's an abomination, and I think we need to get rid of that. The reality is that we've become reliant on these revenue sources, and then eliminating them, immediately is just not sustainable. So I think what I would like to do is I would like to to figure out a path where we can begin to phase out the tangible tax and really not hold so many of our small businesses hostage with this really incredibly regressive tax.
Somewhat akin to the phase out of the automobile tax, that is.
Well, that, obviously that relies on state funding. And I think, the challenge that we have with the tangible tax is that it's set differently by different communities. So there are other communities, obviously, that don't have such a high rate. And it's hard to figure out how to create a formula for the state to be willing to fund something like that. But I think it's an important step forward, particularly for our small businesses who are being taxed on 15-year-old tables and 10-year-old obsolete computers. It's unacceptable.
Mm-hmm. True, very true. I can't let you go without touching on education, public education, key issue for the chamber. We have an education council chaired by Chris Graham from Loch Lord, who is intimately involved in understanding what's happening with the state's takeover of the city schools. What is your point of view on progress that is or isn't being made on that front?
I think we've made very little progress as a result of the takeover. Part of it is because we were interrupted by an unprecedented global pandemic. And another part of it is because I don't really get the sense that the Rhode Island Department of Education has the agility and resources and independence to effect true lasting change. And I think what we have seen is the creation of an additional layer of bureaucracy on top of what was already there. And what makes me very concerned about the takeover, the part that really makes me the most concerned, is that we took away any mechanisms for parental and community engagement and having a voice in the process. And that's very concerning to me. Obviously, education is of critical importance. And when I'm mayor, I'm going to convene a task force that looks across the board to our communities, to our parents, to our educational leaders, to our business sector, where we can say, these are the steps that need to be taken immediately, and these are the long-term steps that need to be taken. And we should plan for either effecting those changes at the local level, if we regain control immediately of the school system, or have a plan to advocate at the state level with a legislative package to effect those changes at the state level through legislative action.
Akin to that, your views on the police force, the police academy, the ability for citizens to work very effectively with our public safety officials. Your macro view on public safety relative to economic development and continued reassurance that people can visit the city, go to work in the city, go to school in the city, and feel safe.
So, I think perception is everything. Unfortunately, Providence is relatively a very safe city, but people don't feel safe. And if people don't feel safe, it doesn't matter what the statistics say. So what we really need to do is we need to build trust and confidence. We need to build trust between the police force and the community and political leadership, which is something that has eroded in the last couple of years. But we also need to build trust amongst the greater community that they can feel safe on the streets of Providence. And I think that that's a process that requires, much like we were talking about relationships in the beginning, a combination of effective communications and building trust. I think it's possible. I think there's a path for us to ensure that we have a properly staffed police force that is interacting with the public, that is getting out of their cars and talking to people and building that trust. I was part of the team in the early 2000s that rolled out Providence's very comprehensive community policing initiative. And the success of that did not depend on fancy algorithms or any types of remarkable policies. It was just getting police officers out of cars, talking to people, sharing their cell phone numbers, sharing their contact, and building that sort of bridge between the police and the community. I think we can come back to that. And I think there's also another example that we have in downtown, which is with the Downtown Improvement District. The presence of Downtown Improvement District staff in their yellow jackets is reassuring to a lot of people. When they see somebody with a smiling face and a uniform, that gives a sense of reassurance. I think, we should be looking at that model and figuring out how to expand that in a sustainable way, not only to increase the footprint in the downtown, but also to reach into our neighborhood commercial districts as well.
We only have a minute or two left, Gonzalo, but we've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about education and economic development and relationship building and the role of the capital city. We've talked about a lot of the issues that you would tackle as the next mayor of the city of Providence. What haven't we talked about that you'd like to end with?
I would like to talk about housing. Housing is the greatest challenge the city of Providence faces because it's directly tied to economic opportunity. If our families are being priced out of Providence and the only people who can afford to live here are people that are coming in from other communities, we are threatened with losing the character and the fabric that has made Providence the remarkable, scrappy, diverse city that it is. We can't afford to lose that. We can't afford to become another bedroom community for Boston. And I think we need to be strategic about investing in housing at all levels, low income housing, workforce housing. We need to be strategic to create more home ownership opportunities. Currently, we're at about 50% owner versus renters, and in the low 20% in owner occupancy. We need to be increasing our owner occupancy. And I have a plan, which I will be unveiling shortly, as to how we can accomplish that. But housing is a critical component of economic development. We want to develop a workforce. We want to make Providence attractive to people at every level. They need to be able to afford to live here.
Yeah, that's an issue that many communities across the state are grappling with in one way or another. And as a result, that's why you see, about a dozen pieces of legislation pending at the State House right now in an attempt to provide various incentives and improvements to actually, create the mechanism, get the flywheel moving faster for shovels in the ground and new affordable housing units. Targeting various income levels, up and moving and addressing this issue, or else, as you point out, workforce housing, very challenging. I see it from a chamber perspective, bringing in, companies that are looking to potentially invest in the greater Providence area, and the notion that, where are they going to live, and what's the rental market look like vis-a-vis other places.
And also, and families that have been here, not only families, like we talk about affordable housing and we always think about low income families. Let's talk about affordable housing in the creative class. Let's talk about the opportunity cost. Providence has celebrated for decades this remarkable, unique arts and culture scene. And what we're seeing is we're seeing an exodus of that creative class moving to the suburbs, moving to Pawtucket, to Woonsocket, to Central Falls, to Fall River, because they can no longer afford to live here. There's an opportunity cost associated with that. The arts and culture are a huge contributor to our economy directly and indirectly, and we're also losing those folks. We are at an unprecedented moment where we have the resources and the mechanisms to act. All we need is the political will and the coordination, and I'm excited about doing that when I'm mayor of Providence.
Gonzalo Cuervo, running for mayor of the city of Providence. Tell folks how they can get in touch with you if they want to volunteer or contribute to your campaign, or to provide thoughts and ideas. How do we get in touch with you?
Absolutely. You can find me at gonzaloforprovidence.com, or you can simply Google Gonzalo Cuervo, and all my contact information will pop up. My website has my cell phone number, it has an email address, it has any way to contact us. And also, if you want to contribute, those are always welcome. And thank you. Thank you, Laurie, for this opportunity.
It's our pleasure to have you on Chamber TV, episode number 166. It's great being able to catch up with all of the candidates that are seeking such an important public position, and we really respect, the initiative that all of you are taking. We need dedicated public leaders, talented public leaders, so we're happy to provide this forum. So thanks everybody for checking in, and we will see you next time.